Good day, students. I am Miss Smart, your Caribbean history teacher for today. Today, we will be studying from the theme Resistance and Revolt, with our focus being on the topic entitled Measures Used to Control Enslaved Africans. The objective for today's lessons are 1. To identify the need for controlling slaves. 2. To examine forms of slave control employed or used by the planters. And 3. Compare and analyze the different slave codes and slave laws used by the 3 European colonies, which are the Spanish, the French, and the British. Why was there a need to have measures to control the slaves? Once again, our topic for today is measures used to control enslaved Africans. The first question that we must ask ourselves is, why was there a need to have measures to control the slaves? Well, there are 4 main reasons that I will share with you today. I hope your notebooks are ready and out because you would not want to miss any of the information. Reason number 1. The slaves did not accept slavery as a permanent way of life. So, in an effort to resist enslavement, they were often starting rebellions and revolts. Reason number 2. The enslaved population outnumbered the population of the white planters. Reason number 3. The planters lived in constant fear of uprising or slaves' rebellion among the slaves. And reason number 4, the planters feared losing their lives, livestock, families, and their properties from being destroyed. For these 3 reasons, the planters needed systems to aid them in keeping the slaves subjected to a subservient position in society. Now that we have highlighted the 4 main reasons why plantation owners created system of slave control, we can move on to the categories of slave control. There are 3 categories of slave control. 6 main categories of slave control. Category 1, physical control. 2, psychological control. 3, economic control. 4, social control. 5, cultural control. And 6, legislations known as slave laws and slave codes. Psychological control. The first method of control to be discussed today is psychological control. Psychological control has to do with measures put in place to control the minds of the slaves, controlling their thought process. One of the fundamental principles of enslavement is that slaves were conditioned to believe that they were inferior and barbaric. In simple terms, they were told that they were unsophisticated, impolite, uncivilized savages. This attacked their confidence, their sense of identity, and self-worth. Wouldn't you feel the same way too if you were attacked as this? In addition, the slaves were often ridiculed for being lazy, stupid, and lacking intelligence. Methods of psychological control. In summary, use these 4 examples to remember the psychological control. 1. Ridicule of looks and features. 2. Mockery of lifestyle and culture. 3. Teaching of white supremacy and black inferiority. And 4. Public punishments. The second form of control is social control. Social control is defined as the method used to manipulate the slaves as a group by dividing them into social groups, making some superior and some inferior. This method was successful as it caused division among the slaves, which worked to the benefit of the plantation owners. Each social group was assigned a level of status, which meant the enslaved now fought to be seen as good in the planters' or plantation owners' eyes. The method of social control was the division of slaves into various groups. Examples of divisions. There are 4 examples of social division used by plantation owners, and they are as follows. 1. Domestic slaves. They were the slaves that worked in the great houses. They were fed better food, they were given better clothes, and they lived in better areas in comparison to the field slaves, and they were trusted to take care of the master's children. Next, we have the drivers. They drove the carriages and were feared among the slaves. Followed by the doctors, skilled workers, and midwives. They were valued by the planters and respected by fellow slaves, and they had freedom of movement, more freedom of movement in comparison to the field slaves. And our third set were the artisans. They were highly valued for their skills by their masters, and they had the most freedom of movements as they were sometimes hired out across plantations. They were known as the jobbing slaves. The effect of social division or grouping are as follows. It caused division among the slaves. 2. It increased loyalty to the plantation owners. And 3. It prevented revolt, as loyal slaves would not only decide not to participate in slave rebellions, but they would report plans to plantation owners of any uprising, rebellion, or running away that they would hear. Next, we have economic control. Economic control is defined as the way in which the planters control the enslaved by limiting if they could earn and how much they could earn, to ensure that the slaves were constantly dependent. Ways the plantation owners use economic control. There are 5 ways the planters or plantation owners executed economic control. Way number 1. Planters/slave owners provided all the food, shelter, clothing, and provision for the slaves to make slaves dependent. Number 2. Slaves spent most of their time, long days on the plantation. This limited the time they had to grow their own food and provision ground for themselves and their families, and limited the amount of produce they had to sell in the market, and they were only allowed to sell on one market a day. Number 3. The slaves were not legally allowed to own land and property. Number 4. Slaves could not sell sugarcane or high-valued animals. And 5. Slaves that had the opportunity to work, such as the carpenters, were limited in the amount they could earn, and most of their earning went to their masters. All these measures were put in place to keep the slaves from being independent and being totally dependent on their masters, and also this would prevent them from saving to buy their freedom where that was allowed. When all other forms of control fail, physical control was used. Physical control refers to punishment given to enslaved for misbehavior. Examples of physical control or punishments are the treadmill, flogging, hanging, mutilation, and torture. Slaves were often put in stocks, which were wooden frames, and then they were left exposed to mockery and ridicule. These actions were often done publicly to discourage disobedience and to convince the enslaved to accept the planters' orders and rules. Students, we have 2 more to go and then we're almost finished. Let us continue. The 5th method of slave control was cultural control. What is cultural control? Cultural control was an extension of social control. Cultural control is defined as the methods by which the plantation owners divide the enslaved into cultural groups. In addition to division, plantation owners prevented each group from performing their cultural practices, disconnecting them from their past, their culture, their customs. This is called deculturalization. Examples of cultural groups are Creole versus African born, lighter skin versus darker skin tones, and mulattoes versus Africans. Creole versus African born is referring to the enslaved born in the Caribbean versus the newly arrived slaves from the continent of Africa. Lighter skin tone versus darker skin tone is where colorism came into place, and different shades of persons, chocolate versus caramel, those things. So the lighter your skin tone was, the more preferred you were. The darker your skin tone was, the more the lower you were on the spectrum, so to say. And the more African you were, or the less African you were. And finally, we had the mulattoes, who are the children of mixed race parents. So when the persons of white ethnicity and the persons of black ethnicity, the whites and the Africans have kids, they were called the mulattoes, and versus those who were of African parents. Ways cultural control was done using deculturalization. These are the following ways. Slaves were forbidden from blowing horns and beating drums, and street carnivals were not permitted. Slaves were baptized into European religion and forced to abandon the religion and cultural practices of their African ancestors and African culture. The fourth way, is slaves could only get married with their master's consent in most colonies. Next, we have enslaved names were changed from African names to Christian names. Sixth reason are slaves were made to celebrate European holidays and European culture. And finally, the enslaved were taught that their culture was uncivilized and that they were to embrace the lifestyle of the European, which was better and more sophisticated. Our final category of slave control is the main instrument of slave control, which were the slave laws and the slave codes. These were legal things that were put in place to control and govern how slaves were treated and their position in society. There are three main colonial groups, and these three main groups had their own law. The Spanish law were referred to as de las siete partillas, the French law, which was known as Code Noir, and the English law. The English had no set law or code, but instead the English law was primarily made by masters and the legislative body in each colony. We will now look at the similarities and the differences between the British, the French, and the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. And as we compare them, we'll compare them from the following categories: the origin of the laws, how the laws treated marriage, how it treated religion, how it treated manumission, what kind of provision was made for the slaves under the law, the judicial rights of the slaves, and also how the slaves were viewed under each of the law. First, let us look at the origin of the law, starting from the Spanish. The Spanish slave law was based on the las siete partillas drawn up by the crown, as they had slaves in Spain before. New laws were added to deal with the Spanish West Indian colonies, and these laws were applied over all overseas colonies. Likewise, with the French, their law was also drawn up by the crown and was applicable throughout all overseas colonies for France. However, the British were different. Their slave laws were made by slave owners and their legislators in each colonies, and there was no set law from the mother country that was applied throughout all overseas colonies. Next, let us look at how each colony of each European nation treated the slaves as it relates to marriages. In the Spanish law, slaves could get married with or without the consent of their masters, and their families were not to be separated when they were being sold. In the French law, slaves could get married with or without the consent of their masters, and like the Spanish, slave families were not to be separated when they were sold. However, with the British, there was no encouragement given for the provision of families in the English law, and members of families could be sold separately. Next, let's move on to how the laws treated religion. With the Spanish, slaves had the right to be taught religious teaching and to be free from work on Sundays and holidays. Likewise, in the French law, there was right and respect given to the slaves to be baptized and to be taught Christian principles. However, with the British, there was no concern about the souls of the slaves until the end of the 18th century. How did each slave law treated manumission? What is manumission, you might ask? Manumission is the process by which an enslaved person would become free. Within the Spanish, there were slave laws with respect to manumission. A slave could be freed if it was proven that his or her masters had mistreated them. 1. 2. The slaves of mixed blood could be bought by his or her father and be set free. And 3. A slave could buy his or her own freedom with or without the consent of their masters, even with installments. Let's see how the French treated manumission. In the French slave law, masters of 20 years or over could free their slaves. And if a man had a child with his enslaved concubine, both she and her children could be free if they were married. And 3, once freed, the former enslaved was entitled to the same rights as those who were born free in the French territories. However, they had to respect their former masters, his wife, and his children. Let us see what the British had to say as it relates to manumission. The British laws did not encourage manumission, even though it allowed it. In fact, persons were penalized for assisting the freedom of slaves, and those who were able to buy their manumission had to pay taxes. There was taxation placed on manumission in the British territories. Judicial rights. Did the slaves in any of these territories have judicial rights? The Spanish. The slaves had the right to complain to the courts if they were treated inhumanely. And for the French, the slaves were granted the right to legal trials and they had some civil rights. However, in the British territories, slaves were not allowed to give evidence in court, especially against a white person. So with the British, they had no judicial rights. Provision. This is one area in which all three nations had the same ruling in their laws. Planters were to provide food, shelter, and clothing, and make provision and care for the elderly and the disabled. For both the British, the French, and the English. How were these slaves viewed? The slaves in the Spanish were viewed as persons, not properties, as they were an extension of the family. And in the French, the slaves were viewed as both property and persons. However, for the British, the slaves were viewed as properties, merchandise owned by their planters. Wow, that was a mouthful, but there's one other that I have to state, and that is the use of Christian teaching. Christian teaching was a form of slave control. The Christians were taught different principles that was presented from the Bible to control them. The planters, even though initially, especially in the British territories, did not encourage Christian teaching, later found it useful to make their slaves more loyal and less prone to revolts by teaching them things like to turn the other cheek when they were offended, by teaching them that everyone was born in their place, and the Bible said that you should obey your masters, and by teaching them that if they lived a good life here and they were obedient, then they would, be able to get into heaven. And if they revolted or acted in any way that was against the teaching of the Bible, they would not get a chance to experience the heaven of the Christian teaching. This teaching was given by missionaries, and it was used by planters to keep the enslaved suppressed and obedient and loyal and less likely to revolt. So in a recap, let us see what we discovered today. Today we discovered that there were slave laws and methods of slave control. We discovered that the main reason for these methods was fear that the slaves would overpower them, fear of losing their life. And the reason for this fear is that the slaves outnumbered the whites, 1, and 2, the slaves did not accept servitude. They did not accept enslavement as their permanent way of life. And we also discovered that there are 6 main categories of slave control, and that was psychological, physical, cultural, social, slave control, and economical. I hope today's lesson was informative, and I hope that you took notes and that you will be able to remember these facts for the future as you study. Once again, I am Miss Smart, your Caribbean history teacher for today. Have a good day. Thank you for listening, and all the best with your exams.